My name is David Leinster, and on behalf of Contemporary Calgary's curators and staff, I'd like to welcome you to Everywhere We Are. First, I would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 First Nations, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nation, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. We are also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and we acknowledge that Contemporary Calgary is immediately adjacent to the Bow River, a site that resonates with us today and with Indigenous populations for thousands of years. Everywhere We Are draws on a collection from Calgary. This video is about one of the artworks in the exhibition. Warehouse 1993-2015 is a film projection work by acclaimed Canadian artist Wyn Geleynse. Born in Rotterdam, Holland, Wyn Geleynse emigrated to Canada at a young age. The family settled in London, Ontario, where the artist still lives today. Geleynse received the Governor General's Award for Visual and Media Arts in 2018 in recognition for his groundbreaking multimedia work spanning some 5 decades. Warehouse 1993-2015 is one of 5 works by the artist that you'll see here in Everywhere We Are. In this video, you'll hear excerpts of a conversation between Wyn Geleynse and the collector Ken Bradley. They talk about the origins of Warehouse 1993-2015 and, importantly, its connection to one of the worst natural disasters in Alberta's history, the Calgary flood of 2013. Warehouse 1993 was well documented and was considered an important film projection work. It incorporated all the hallmark features of Geleynse's art practice in terms of both the production techniques used and the central issues it dealt with. Geleynse's first warehouse, the Granville Island Shipwrights Warehouse, was made the year before in 1992, but it was Warehouse 1993 where Geleynse perfected the construction techniques for building a warehouse. Warehouse 1993 masterfully confronted complex issues that asked questions about self-identity, male sexuality, anxiety, powerlessness, and memory, using a constructed warehouse, collected childhood objects, projected still images of a hooded, frenzied man, Geleynse, and sound created by a film projector and film looping.
The first time I saw Warehouse 1993, I was captivated by its poetic starkness, the simplicity of its visual aesthetic, and the edginess of its complex, unresolved narrative. For me, it was a perfect work. I still believe that today. I acquired it for the purpose of ensuring that it would make its way into a public collection so future generations of Canadians could access it.
Then June 19, 2013 struck, and Calgary experienced the devastation of flooding. The initial assessment of damage was first encouraging that Warehouse 1993 could be conserved. Restoration commenced immediately. 22 months later, due to continuing evaporation of Elbow River siltwater from the structural base of the warehouse, the updated assessment determined the work was now damaged beyond repair. This began the discussion that led to the creation of Warehouse 1993-2015.
The reassessment of the damage to Warehouse in March 2015 was painful news to me. It brought me back to the days and weeks immediately following the flood in 2013, that feeling in my gut and the feeling of guilt that I had somehow not properly taken the precautions needed to protect the work in my collection. Telling Wyn the work was now destroyed was very painful. I remember in that first phone call asking Wyn, could the memory of Warehouse, a work that speaks to remembering and feelings of powerlessness and anxiety, dwell again in a new work where the experiences and memories of the flood could live? This question began the discussion about a commissioned work that led ultimately to the creation of Warehouse 1993-2015. In the following tape discussion, you'll hear Wyn and I discuss our reactions to the destruction of Warehouse 1993, our early conversations about a commissioned work, Wyn's process for creating the new work, and the subtle differences that exist between Wyn's approach and my approach to the new work. So when the warehouse in 1993 was damaged in the Calgary flood in June 2013, the initial damage assessment confirmed the work could be conserved. What was your reaction 22 months later when told that due to time-delayed damage, the work now had to be destroyed?
Well, I was surprised, as you know, and I was really quite dismayed. But because the time frame was so long, and I had a lot of distance from it, nor, did I directly experience the disaster, the flood, and everything else. So I didn't have as much an emotional response other than those two things. But I did think an awful lot about Chris Cran and Mr. Moffat, considering the extent of what they lost. And I think that's when I really began to feel really terrible about what had happened to my friends. And if anything, it really twigged my response to their loss more than mine. The actual physical structure, the building itself, was made out of a mixture of actual concrete, sand, and something called Roadplex, which is a plasticizer. So I was surprised when they said that the building was ruined because it was basically plastic concrete. So once you bought it and they cleaned it out, I think they realized that the damage was not as extensive. And that in many ways informed me a little bit that there was a potential there for it. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's important for you to know that the material in and of itself in some ways saved the structure from utter total destruction.
So in late April, late spring of 2015, when you were told that the work had to be destroyed, and there was discussion of the commission, what ultimately made you decide to accept the commission?
Well, I like challenges. I had an open vessel here, and actually, you in some way was very much the tipping point when you asked me about the idea of using audio recordings from some of the news reportage from the reportage, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And that sort of tipped it directly into a potential for something that was entirely new. Once things started turning for me, idea-wise, I was just kind of impatient to get to it. I mean, I did everything together, the sound, the building, back and forth, back and forth. After a certain point, once I was able to collect all the sound and added the sound I wanted to it, it started building itself.
Mm.
And it just became a pleasure of going in every day. I rented a very specific space for it, which was very bright, well lit. It was summertime, and it just literally built itself. And I think some of the things I like the best in my life, they tend to build themselves. I've seemed to be a means to their end, but the idea takes me over.
Under the terms of the commission,
Mhm.
the work had to have its own unique artistic merits, that it was not simply to be a rebuild. How did this inform the many decisions subsequently that you would have had to make that eventually led to the work Warehouse 1993, 2015?
Well, I think that request gave me permission to put the other stuff into the past.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
That I was confronted with something in my mind now was entirely new.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fairly easy once certain things sort of fell into place, like your suggestion about the audio, when I knew the recordings that I was hoping to get from people, and then the additional recordings of the Dante recitations. It was just literally like having permission to do whatever I wanted. And as I said, once all those things were like roughly assembled, it just all started coming together all by itself. It was very organic, but I really wanted to recognize the one thing about the piece: it did have a former history. And this was almost like a reincarnation into a different personality, I guess, for want of a better way of describing it. And I felt it was a personality of greater depth. I think there was a maturity uh, in it. And I think there was, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there was a recognition that um, time changes things. And I guess I wanted to bring a real personality or personalities into it, where the work really, in the end, what really lived up to my very first initial expectations of a warehouse for memories. Though the objects, the original objects, were wonderful from my childhood and things I collected all my life. They were all like souvenirs in the French sense.
Mhm.
But they were of the past, like all souvenirs are. But because of the flood, there was like a real presence that the flood created in my mind, which then, of course, led me to Dante, The River Styx. Well, this is the favorite part for me to talk about. There's something biblical about floods, right?
I thought of that, but you're right.
You know,
You are
that's
right.
the obvious one. But then the not so obvious one, and this is why I liked it. This is why I chose it. It's about him crossing the River Styx, and it was all the ghosts in the water that kept appearing. And to me, they were like a metaphor for all the voices of the victims of the flood and how people reacted, all the people that recorded on for me so generously. So that's why I ended up choosing it, because I think there was a parallel there. And this was a disaster for some people, unprecedented. They lost everything. There was a gravitas to the voice. I have all these recordings by different people of all three books.
So as a commissioned work, Warehouse 1993-2015 exists because of events in Calgary in 2013. I'm very curious to know, when does that affect how you personally relate to it?
I think my association is through the history of the work itself, from its very first iteration to its second iteration.
Mhm.
And I think it's like a history of someone maturing, like a maturation.
Mhm.
And I think it sort of reflects both the times, both my sense of adulthood when I first made it, and the idea of memory, and how an important part your past plays, and how in many ways that decides, helps determine who you are. And I think now, not now, but at the time that I built a new piece, that it certainly, I think it showed the level of maturity and the trust in the idea that built itself.
Hmm.
I think initially I was unsure about the work. But then when I started doing a new piece, I felt not a degree of arrogance or self-determination or predetermination. I felt really good, because I felt it was actually reflecting maybe what I really intended to at the very beginning, but I just simply wasn't mature enough to be able to do it.
For me, what is so beautiful is that the new work has created this kind of spiritual kind of resolution, like a redemption, like that which has died has now come back. And so it was very interesting that you talk about it in terms of maturity and dealing with the issues you were dealing in early in the 90s and the 80s. In many of your works, we see similar issues that you dealt with in the original Warehouse. I tend to sort of reflect back in terms of the reference point for me is the flood, the damage, and now the resurrection.
As an artist, when you put work out there, it takes a lot in a life of its own. It doesn't matter what your intent was, or my intent, I mean.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter. And let's face it, this work is a prime example of that. As we joke, and as you and I talked about, this sort of seminal forgetting that in many ways propelled this work into what it was. And I think that's the wonderful part about being an artist, right? Things are always in flux, and nothing happens in a straight line. It's like a ball rolling down the street. You never know it's going to go straight, left, right, or center. Unlike the original experience, this was an experience, instead of me defining as I went along, the idea in many ways defined itself, and I was just following its direction. Meaning, I guess I was trusting my instincts more than I did in the first time. So I think that's that issue of maturity that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
To bring it back to that.
There's nearly 23 years that separates Warehouse 1993 from Warehouse 1993 2015. In your words, is that something that's significant, that time difference?
It didn't really cross my mind. I think what crossed my mind that, of course, would be different was to sort of live up to the respect of the people that participated in the making of the work. That, of course, would be different because I wanted it to reflect what they went through. But I didn't want it to be a literal reflection. I wanted it to be sort of an ebb and flow, like a tide. But I wanted, like, the sound was sort of designed like water, where things would come in and out, like waves crashing on a beach. It was repetitive, but it would go up and it would go down and stuff like that. But I wanted the voices to be heard, but I wanted to be fragmented because, being explicit is not the way I sort of work. And I think this allowed for a greater subtlety. I think the initial work was in many ways just sort of like blunt force drama, explicit. It's all about memory and all these objects, and everybody knew that stuff. Everybody could relate to it. So it was probably a bit easier to read. But again, it goes back to that thing of like probably, more immature ideas than I had 23 years later.
And in the new piece, you do have to get very close. So there is a commitment on the part of the viewer.
And that's on purpose.
You have to say, I want to participate in this. And I love that. And if you sit down, which makes it easier to see the actual projected image, there is even a further commitment on the part of the viewer to want to participate in that.
Yes, and I very much want that. And it's sort of a pattern in my work.
Yeah.
Over time, I've always made things much smaller. No, I've always scaled things within the view, within the view angle of the viewer, so they could see everything without having to strain, and they could then deal with whatever was presented.
You commented on the original childhood objects are still exist.
Yeah, but I'm always open.
Yeah.
To ideas. I don't pass off any potential for an idea. It doesn't mean it would be successful, but I really would like to look at them because it would be nice to visit some old friends.
Maybe the final question, that is there anything else you would like us to know about the new work?
No, I think we've covered everything. And to be perfectly frank with you, I really enjoyed the dialogue over the last few weeks about the history of the work. It's not something I've ever experienced before to this depth, and it's been both challenging and sort of enlightening for me.
Yeah.
And it's given me an insight into the collector's point of view that I never had. And I'm glad you were able to share that with me. I want to thank you for that because you put your kids out in the world. You don't know what's going to happen to them. You don't know.
Artists are special. Artists are important. We need to respect and nurture their vital contributions to our everyday lives. Through their art, we are led to a better place of knowing and understanding. I know I am. Thank you, Wyn, for creating this wonderful work, so rich in its layered meaning. It will forever remind me that we found our way through and beyond the destructiveness of the Calgary flood in 2013. We are stronger and wiser for having done so. Thank you, Contemporary Calgary, for making this video possible and for all you are doing to build a preeminent gallery dedicated to contemporary art and to supporting the artists who make it.
We hope you enjoyed learning more about Warehouse 1993-2015, how the work was commissioned, and its special significance to Calgary.